January 17, 1943, East Anglia, England, 0400 hours. The frost clung to the metal skin of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress like a second armor, crystalline and unforgiving. In the pre-dawn blackness, ground crews moved between the bombers with flashlights that carved thin paths through fog so dense it seemed to swallow sound itself. The air smelled of high-octane gasoline, cold earth, and something else, something the young men boarding these aircraft couldn't yet name. It was the scent of machinery pushed to its absolute limit, of oil and cordite and fear compressed into riveted aluminum. 24 bombers sat on the hard stands at Thurley Airfield, their Wright Cyclone engines silent, waiting. Each fortress carried 10 men, 240 souls who had eaten their powdered eggs and drank their bitter coffee in mess halls where no one spoke above a whisper. They knew the target, Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing factories deep in the heart of Germany. They knew the distance, they knew the odds. What they could not know, standing there in the January cold with their breath turning to steam, was that they were about to fly into a definition of hell that would rewrite the very doctrine of strategic bombing. The planners had calculated acceptable losses. The statisticians had run their numbers, but mathematics cannot account for what happens to the human spirit at 25,000 feet when the sky turns black with flak and the Messerschmitts come screaming through your formation like wolves through a flock. The doctrine had seemed so elegant on paper, precision daylight bombing, the American answer to the British night raids that scattered high explosives across German cities with the blunt instrument of area bombardment. The United States Army Air Forces would be different, surgical, moral. The Norden bomb site could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. Strategic targets would be eliminated while minimizing civilian casualties.
German war production would collapse under the weight of American industrial might turned skyward. 50 caliber machine guns and its reputation for absorbing punishment would fly in tight formations that created overlapping fields of fire. Flying fortresses, indeed, bristling with so much defensive firepower that enemy fighters would be slaughtered if they dared approach. That was the theory. That was what the men climbing into those aircraft had been told during training in Nebraska and Texas, where the sky was vast and empty, and the only thing that could hurt you was mechanical failure or pilot error. They had believed it because they were 20 years old, most of them, and belief was all they had. They had watched the promotional films showing B-17s returning from missions with holes you could crawl through, engines feathered, tail sections half shot away, still flying, the fortress that could not be knocked down. They had absorbed the confidence of their commanders, men like Curtis LeMay and Ira Aker, who spoke with absolute certainty about the mathematics of strategic bombing. They expected to face opposition, certainly. They expected danger. But they expected to win through superiority of technology and courage, through the sheer abundance of resources that America could pour into this aerial war. What they would discover instead was that theories dissolve at the altitude where oxygen must be breathed through a mask, and the temperature outside the aircraft sits at 40 degrees below zero. The first mission to Schweinfurt came on August 17, 1943, Black Thursday, though it would not earn that name until the second mission 2 months later made the first look like a rehearsal for catastrophe. 60 bombers were lost that day in October, 600 men. The numbers felt abstract until you understood what they meant, until you pictured 2,000 mothers receiving telegrams with identical language expressing the nation's regret.
The Army Air Forces had declared that losses of 10% per mission were sustainable. Replacements could be trained, aircraft could be manufactured, but no one had calculated the psychological mathematics. No one had quantified what it meant for a crew to watch the bomber flying 300 feet to their right simply cease to exist in a blossom of orange flame, to see men tumbling through the sky like broken toys, some with parachutes that opened, most without. The German defenses had evolved with terrifying efficiency.
The early missions in 1942 had been almost experimental, small formations striking targets along the French coast, learning the brutal grammar of daylight bombing. But by 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed tactics specifically designed to shred the American formations. Head-on attacks, 4 fighters in line abreast, coming straight through the nose of the bombers where the defensive armament was weakest. The pilots of those Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were veterans, many of them aces who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. They knew exactly where to aim. They knew that the B-17's oxygen system ran through lines that could be severed with a well-placed burst. They knew that a 20mm cannon shell into the cockpit would kill both pilots and send the fortress into an uncontrollable dive. And then there was the flak, anti-aircraft artillery positioned around every strategic target in concentric rings of mathematical death. The 88mm guns that could throw a shell to 30,000 feet, where it would explode in a burst of shrapnel moving faster than rifle bullets. The German gunners used radar to calculate altitude and speed. They would fire in volleys, creating boxes of exploding steel through which the bomber formations had to fly. There was no evasion.
The doctrine required straight and level flight for the bomb run, sometimes for 10 minutes or more, while the bombardier hunched over his Norden sight, making infinitesimal adjustments. 10 minutes of flying through a storm of steel, holding course, holding altitude, while the flak burst so thick it looked like you could walk on it. The crews developed their own mathematics of survival, superstitions built from the wreckage of probability. Some carried lucky coins or photographs. Some refused to fly without specific items of clothing. Others performed elaborate rituals before boarding, touching the aircraft in a specific sequence. But the calculations were merciless. A bomber crew's tour of duty was 25 missions. Statistical analysis suggested that a crew completing 25 missions over Germany in 1943 had roughly a 30% chance of survival. 30%. Worse odds than Russian roulette played with a 5-chamber revolver. The mission to Regensburg on the same day as the first Schweinfurt raid forced the B-17 crews to fly beyond the range of fighter escort and then continue south to bases in North Africa rather than return to England. 146 bombers went to Regensburg. 122 came back. The ones that made it to Africa landed at primitive airstrips, with wounded men bleeding out in the radio compartment, with dead pilots strapped into their seats, with hydraulic systems shot away and landing gear that wouldn't extend. One fortress set down with more than 1,000 holes in its airframe. Another landed with 3 engines dead, and the 4th coughing on its last reserves of fuel. The crews climbed out, and some of them simply sat down on the tarmac and stared at nothing, their hands shaking, their faces the color of ash. This was the reality that no amount of training could prepare them for. The cold alone was a weapon. At 25,000 feet, the temperature could drop to 60 below zero. The oxygen masks would freeze to their faces. The machine guns would jam because the oil in their mechanisms had turned solid. Frostbite could claim fingers and toes in minutes if the heated flight suits failed. Men would urinate into their boots because leaving position to use the relief tube meant exposing flesh to air that could kill. 50 calibers at fighters that appeared and vanished in seconds, their hands so numb they could barely feel the triggers. And the fighters kept coming. The German pilots had learned to recognize the moments of maximum vulnerability. They would wait until the formations were deep over Germany, beyond the range of the P-47 Thunderbolts that could escort them part way. Then they would mass, sometimes 30 or 40 fighters attacking a single group of bombers, coming from 12 o'clock high, from 6 o'clock low, from the flanks where the formation's defensive fire was weakest. They would press their attacks to point-blank range, sometimes colliding with the bombers in their determination to bring them down. Some German pilots, ammunition exhausted, would attempt to sever tail sections with their propellers or knock bombers out of formation with their wings. The symbolism of the B-17 itself became a kind of theological argument about American industrial power. Each bomber represented an investment of labor and resources that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could match. 18,000 man-hours to build. Aluminum mined in the mountains of the American West, transported across a continent on rail lines that never feared bombardment.
Engines manufactured in plants where workers produced them by the thousands, where the assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, under lights that never dimmed because electricity was abundant and fuel was abundant, and there was no need to hide production in forests or caves. The very existence of these aircraft was a message to Germany. We can afford to build these by the hundreds.
We can afford to lose them by the dozens. We will replace them faster than you can destroy them. But that message meant nothing to the boy from Iowa sitting in the ball turret underneath the bomber, curled into a space barely larger than his body, surrounded by nothing but plexiglass between him and empty air. It meant nothing when the fighter attacks began, and he would rotate his turret, tracking the fighters, firing in bursts that consumed ammunition at a terrifying rate. 50 calibers, the spent brass cascading down into the collection bag, the whole turret filling with the acrid smoke of burnt powder. He could see everything from down there. He watched other bombers die with a clarity that the rest of the crew was spared. He saw the fortress off the left wing take a direct flak hit in the bomb bay and simply vaporize, there 1 second and gone the next. Not even debris, just an expanding cloud of aluminum confetti and smoke. He saw the bomber ahead of them get hit by a fighter's 20mm cannon, saw the entire crew bail out, counting the parachutes as they blossomed. 7, 8, 9. Only 9. Someone hadn't made it out. The waist gunners had their own horror. They stood at their windows in the freezing wind, brass casings ankle-deep around their feet, firing at fighters that came so close they could see the faces of the German pilots. Some of those pilots were teenagers themselves, boys pulled from the Hitler Youth and given a few dozen hours of training before being thrown into combat. The life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot in 1943 was measured in weeks. But they came anyway, wave after wave, because they were defending their homeland, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew what American bombs were doing to their cities. The bombers that made it through the fighter attacks still had to face the flak. The first bursts would appear as black puffs in the distance, seemingly random. Then the gunners would bracket the formation, adjust their fuse timings, and the sky would fill with explosions. The sound was unlike anything else, a sharp crack that could be felt through the entire airframe, then the patter of shrapnel against aluminum, like hail on a tin roof. Except this hail could punch through metal, could sever control cables, could explode fuel tanks. The pilots would hold their course, gripping the yoke with both hands, making tiny corrections to stay in formation. The co-pilot would watch the engine instruments, calling out any fluctuations. Oil pressure dropping on number 3, manifold pressure spiking on number 2, cylinder head temperature climbing into the red. And still they flew on. The bombardier lying prone in the nose, eye pressed to the Norden sight, making his adjustments while flak burst around them and fighters made their runs. The target had to be hit. The factories had to be destroyed. The doctrine demanded it. So they flew straight and level through hell itself, and when the bombs finally released, 12 500-pound bombs from each aircraft, falling in a stick that would take nearly a minute to reach the ground from that altitude, there was only a brief moment of relief before the pilot could finally turn away and begin the long flight home. Except home was still 500 miles away, across territory where every German fighter within range would be vectored to their position, where the bomber with battle damage would start to fall behind, unable to keep up with the formation, becoming a straggler. And stragglers died. The fighter pilots knew to pick them off, these wounded fortresses limping home alone. A B-17 without the protection of formation defensive fire was just a large, slow target. Some crews would make the agonizing decision to bail out over Germany rather than continue and face certain death. Others would stay with their aircraft, nursing it along on 3 engines or 2, sometimes all the way to the English Channel before ditching in the water, hoping the air-sea rescue would find them before hypothermia did. The ones who made it back to England would circle their bases, firing flares to indicate wounded aboard, getting priority to land. The control tower would count them as they came in, comparing the numbers to the formation that had departed that morning. 36 bombers had taken off. 28 were coming back. 8 missing. 80 men gone. The ambulances would be waiting on the hard stands. The flight surgeons would be ready. Some wounded could be saved. Some could not. The dead would be carried to the base morgue. The aircraft would be assessed by maintenance crews who would shake their heads at the damage and wonder how the thing had stayed in the air. Holes in the wings large enough to crawl through, entire sections of fuselage shredded.
One bomber landed with the nose blown completely off, the bombardier and navigator gone, the pilot somehow maintaining control with wind screaming through the cockpit at 200 miles per hour. The surviving crews would be debriefed, fed a shot of whiskey, given hot food, and sent to their bunks, where some would sleep the sleep of absolute exhaustion, and others would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the mission, wondering if they could have saved the men in the bomber that went down, wondering if the next mission would be their last. Doing the mathematics. If they had completed 6 missions, they had 19 left. 19 more times through the flak and the fighters. 19 more times rolling the dice. The odds suggested that most of them wouldn't make it. That was the truth they lived with every day.
The transformation that occurred within these men was profound and documented in letters, in diaries, in the flat affect that appears in photographs taken over the course of their tours. The boys who had arrived in England with their Hollywood smiles and their confidence in American technology aged decades in months. They developed what would later be called the 1,000-yard stare. Eyes that had seen too much, that no longer focused on the person in front of them, but on something beyond, some middle distance where the dad still flew. The psychological casualty rate was nearly as high as the physical. Combat fatigue, they called it then, or lack of moral fiber in the cruel terminology of some commanders. Men who simply could not force themselves to board the aircraft anymore. Men who would shake uncontrollably at the sound of engines. Men who would wake screaming in the night, trapped again in the ball turret of a burning bomber that was falling from the sky. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, that was the mission that broke the doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing. 291 B-17s took off that morning. 231 returned. 60 bombers lost. More than 600 men. It was unsustainable. No amount of American industrial production could replace crews at that rate. The bomber offensive was temporarily halted. The planners went back to their maps and their charts and admitted what the men flying the missions had known for months, that bombers without fighter escort deep over Germany were being slaughtered. The solution would be the P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range to escort the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. But the Mustang was still months away from deployment in sufficient numbers, so the crews waited and trained and flew shorter missions and watched their comrades' bunks stay empty. Yet they kept flying. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing. They could have refused. They could have broken. Some did, but most returned to their aircraft mission after mission, knowing the odds, understanding fully what awaited them over Germany. Why? Some flew for each other, for the men in their crew who had become closer than brothers. Some flew for abstract ideals about freedom and democracy, though those ideals seemed very distant at 25,000 feet when your wingman was dying. Some flew because they were 20 years old and could not conceive of their own mortality, even when it sat in the seat next to them. And some flew because they had been given a task and they would complete it, even if it killed them. The B-17 itself became a symbol that transcended its function as a weapons platform. It was the physical manifestation of American abundance. Every rivet, every sheet of aluminum, every instrument in the cockpit spoke of a nation that could afford to do things the hard way, the expensive way, because resources were not the limiting factor. The Germans had been forced to design fighters that were cheap and quick to produce, stripped of everything non-essential. They used slave labor and hidden factories. They rationed aluminum and rubber and gasoline. Meanwhile, America was producing B-17s at the rate of 16 per day at the Boeing plant in Seattle alone. The workers who built them, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before the war, performed their tasks with a precision that bordered on reverence. They knew that men's lives depended on every weld, every rivet, every electrical connection.
Some factories would put notes inside the airframes, messages of encouragement to the crews who would fly them, prayers for their safe return. The Germans understood what the B-17 represented. They understood that each bomber over their cities was not just a weapon, but a message about industrial capacity, about a nation so wealthy it could afford to fight a war on the other side of the world and still produce more material than all of Germany's factories combined. It was psychologically devastating. Every formation of American bombers was proof that Germany was losing, that the 1,000-year Reich would not survive to see its 5th birthday. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to counter this with claims of hundreds of bombers shot down, with newsreels showing German fighters victorious in combat. But the people in the cities below could count. They could see the formations growing larger each month, the bombing growing more accurate, the defenses increasingly unable to prevent the destruction of their homes and factories. The missions continued through 1944, as the P-51s finally arrived in numbers sufficient to provide escort all the way to the target and back. The loss rates dropped dramatically. What had been a near-suicidal endeavor became merely extremely dangerous. The bomber offensive shifted from survival to dominance. Berlin was struck repeatedly. The synthetic oil plants that fueled the German military machine were systematically destroyed. The ball bearing factories, the aircraft assembly plants, the rail yards, all hit again and again until German war production began to collapse. But the cost had been horrific. From 1942 to 1945, the 8th Air Force alone suffered 26,000 killed and more than 23,000 prisoners of war. The bomber crews had a higher casualty rate than the Marines in the Pacific. These were not men storming beaches or fighting in jungles. They were mechanic sons and farmers' boys from Kansas who climbed into aluminum tubes and flew into curtains of steel 5 miles above the earth. There was no glory in it of the Hollywood variety. There were no dramatic speeches before missions, no stirring music.
There was only the routine of death normalized into duty. Wake at 4 a.m. Breakfast. Briefing. Pre-flight. Takeoff. Formation assembly. Cross the channel. Enter German airspace. Fighters. Flak. Bomb run. Turn for home. More fighters. More flak. Count the aircraft. Count the missing. Debrief. Sleep if you can. Repeat tomorrow. The objects they carried became talismans against chaos. A photograph creased from handling. A letter from home read so many times the paper was falling apart at the folds. A lucky coin rubbed smooth. The co-pilot who would touch the same sequence of instruments before every takeoff. The ball turret gunner who sang the same song to himself during the bomb run. These rituals were mathematics of a different kind. Attempts to impose order on randomness, to believe that survival was something you could control through preparation and will. It wasn't. They knew it wasn't. But the rituals continued because they were all that stood between sanity and the screaming understanding that death could arrive in any second without warning, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. The epilogue to the story of the B-17 missions over Germany is written in the post-war world they helped create. The factories they destroyed stayed destroyed. The cities they bombed were rebuilt, but the Third Reich itself was reduced to rubble and memory. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its horrific cost, had achieved its objective. German war production was crippled. The Luftwaffe was swept from the skies. The Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver was strangled by lack of fuel, and when the ground forces finally crossed the Rhine in 1945, they did so under skies completely dominated by Allied air power. But the true legacy of those missions lives in the lesson they taught about the price of ideology confronting abundance. The Nazi vision had been built on conquest and slave labor, on the idea that superior will could overcome material disadvantage.
The young men in the B-17s proved otherwise. They proved that democracy, for all its messy inefficiency, could mobilize resources and human will in ways that fascism could not match. Every bomber that lifted off from England was built by free workers, paid fair wages, choosing to participate in the war effort. Every crew member had volunteered. No one was forced into those aircraft. They went because they believed in something larger than themselves, even if they couldn't always articulate what that something was. The sound of Wright Cyclone engines warming up on a cold morning in East Anglia, that sound was freedom's arithmetic made audible. It was the roar of a nation that could afford to build machines by the thousands and send them into battle knowing that losses would be replaced. It was the thunder of democracy's industrial might turned toward a singular purpose. And though the cost was measured in broken bodies and psychological wounds that would never fully heal, though the price was extracted from boys barely old enough to vote, the ledger closed with a truth that no amount of propaganda could erase. The fortresses flew, and they kept flying, and in the end, the sky belonged to them. That was the story told in aluminum and blood at 25,000 feet above a continent at war. That abundance defeats ideology, that production defeats propaganda, that the nation which can afford to lose 60 bombers in a single day and return with 600 the next week will ultimately prevail. The men who flew those missions rarely spoke of such grand themes afterward. They spoke instead of their crews, of the particular sound a B-17 made when its engines were synchronized perfectly, of the view from the waist window on a clear day when you could see the curve of the earth. They spoke of the missions they survived, and the friends who did not. They did not call themselves heroes. They said only that they had done what was asked of them.
And what was asked was everything. What they gave was enough.